The wind on Sycamore Avenue didn't just blow, it hunted, a predatory force that sought out the gaps in Arthur's threadbare tweed coat, the one that had been a Brooks Brothers original 20 years ago, but was now a map of his failures, stained with grease and smelling of the damp, moldy back seat of the car he had lost 3 weeks ago. He stood on the sidewalk, his 72-year-old knees knocking together with a violence that threatened to buckle his legs, staring at the warm, golden glow spilling from the bay windows of number 402, a house that looked like every dream he had ever sold and then lost, a fortress of brick and ivy that mocked the shivering, gray-bearded wreck of a man standing in its shadow. He didn't know why he had stopped here, specifically here, on a night when the temperature had plunged to single digits and the shelters downtown were full to bursting with men who were younger, stronger, and faster at securing a cot than he was. Perhaps it was the smell of wood smoke curling from the chimney, a scent that triggered a primal, agonizing memory of the library in his old mansion. Or perhaps it was just the fact that his feet, wrapped in plastic bags inside boots that were 2 sizes too big, simply refused to take another step. He was going to die tonight. He knew that with the calm, detached clarity that comes at the end of a long, losing battle with gravity. And the thought wasn't terrifying anymore. It was almost a relief, a cessation of the constant gnawing hunger that felt like a rat eating his stomach lining. But the instinct to survive, that stubborn lizard brain impulse that had once made him the most feared real estate developer in the tri-state area, forced his hand up, lifting the heavy brass knocker that felt like ice against his split skin. He knocked 3 times, the sound hollow and intrusive, a desecration of the suburban silence. And then he waited, his head bowed, humiliated by his own existence, praying that whoever opened the door would just call the police rather than pity him, because pity was the one thing Arthur Sterling could not survive. The wait was an eternity, a span of time measured in the fading sensation of his toes, until the heavy oak door swung inward with a well-oiled sigh, revealing a foyer that looked like heaven. Warm, soft light reflecting off polished hardwood, a staircase runner that looked softer than any bed he had slept in for a decade, and a woman standing in the center of it all, wiping her hands on a linen apron, her face obscured by the backlight. "Yes? Can I help?" Her voice was polite, the guarded but courteous tone of the wealthy addressing the inconvenience of the world, but the sentence died in her throat, strangled by a sudden sharp intake of breath that sounded like a sob, and Arthur, squinting against the glare, felt his own heart hammer a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs, because he knew that voice, he knew the tilt of that head, he knew the way she held her shoulders when she was defensive, even though he hadn't seen her since the day he had screamed until his throat was raw and pointed a shaking finger at the front gates of his estate. It was Sarah, his Sarah, the daughter he had banished to the wolves 25 years ago because she had dared to love a man whose hands were stained with engine oil instead of ink. He tried to turn, to run, to throw himself back into the snow and vanish before she could see what he had become, but his body was a traitor, frozen in place by the shock and the sudden rush of heat escaping the house, and he just stood there, swaying like a dead tree in the wind, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Sarah took a step forward, her eyes wide, scanning the ruin of his face, the matted gray beard, the sores on his cheeks, the grime that had settled into the deep lines around his eyes. And for a second, he saw the flicker of revulsion, the instinctive recoil of a clean animal faced with a diseased one, and it cut him deeper than the cold ever could. "My God," she whispered, the words trembling in the air between them, not a greeting, but an accusation. "Arthur?" She didn't call him Dad. That title had been revoked a quarter-century ago in a lawyer's office where he had formally disinherited her, and hearing his Christian name from her lips was a gavel strike of judgment. He managed to croak out a sound, a rusty, broken noise that might have been Sarah, but before he could beg for forgiveness or turn to flee, the sound of heavy footsteps approached from the kitchen, confident, heavy strides that vibrated through the floorboards. "Sarah? Who is it? The roast is resting and the boys are—" The man who stepped into the hallway stopped dead, his hand still holding the carving knife, his eyes locking onto Arthur with a recognition that turned his expression from domestic contentment to a mask of absolute granite fury. It was Leo, the grease monkey, the man Arthur had called a bottom-feeding parasite to his face, the man he had predicted would leave Sarah pregnant and destitute within a year. But the man standing there wasn't the skinny 20-year-old mechanic Arthur remembered. This was a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and solid, wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than Arthur's first car, his hair peppered with distinguished gray, radiating the kind of quiet, immovable power that Arthur had spent his life pretending to have. Leo looked at Arthur, then at the snow blowing into his foyer, then at his wife's pale, shock-frozen face, and for a terrifying 10 seconds, Arthur was certain, absolutely certain, that Leo was going to use that carving knife, or at the very least, physically throw him off the porch. The tension was thick as to choke on, a physical weight in the hallway, the past colliding with the present in a violent, silent crash. Arthur lowered his eyes, unable to meet the gaze of the man he had wronged so completely. I didn't know. I didn't know this was your house. I'll go." He turned, his boots slipping on the threshold, stumbling towards the darkness, but a hand shot out, not Sarah's, but Leo's, catching him by the shoulder of his filthy coat, the grip strong and undeniable. "Stop," Leo said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of warmth but commanded by a rigid moral code that Arthur had never possessed. "You walk out there tonight, you die, and I'm not going to explain to my sons why their grandfather froze to death on our doorstep." Leo pulled him inside, not gently, but with the necessary force to move a man who had lost the will to move himself, and kicked the door shut against the wind, sealing the silence inside. The warmth hit Arthur like a physical blow, making his head swim and his frozen skin burn with pins and needles that made him gasp in pain. He stood on the expensive Persian rug, water dripping from his clothes, a puddle of brown slush forming around his boots, acutely aware that he was polluting this sanctuary with his very presence. Sarah was pressed against the wall, her hand over her mouth, tears finally spilling over, not tears of joy, but tears of trauma, the shock of seeing the monster of her childhood reduced to a pitiable ghost. "Take off the coat," Leo commanded, his voice flat, "and the boots. Put them in this bag." He produced a heavy-duty trash bag from a closet, holding it open like he was handling hazardous waste. Arthur obeyed, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the fabric, and as he peeled away the layers of filth, he felt stripped of his last defense, standing there in a stained undershirt and trousers held up with a piece of rope, the smell of his own unwashed body filling the small space. He expected them to recoil, to gag, but Leo just tied the bag tight and dropped it in the corner. "Go wash your hands," Leo said, pointing to a powder room off the hall. "Use the soap, twice, then come to the dining room." It wasn't an invitation, it was an order, the kind a warden gives to a prisoner, and Arthur shuffled to the bathroom, catching a glimpse of himself in the mirror, a skeletal, hollow-eyed stranger with wild hair and gray skin, and he barely recognized the face that had once smiled out from the cover of Forbes magazine. He scrubbed his hands until they were raw, the hot water stinging his cracked knuckles, watching the black water swirl down the drain, wishing it could wash away the last 20 years of mistakes. When he emerged, the hallway was empty, the sound of silverware clinking on china drifting from the dining room. He walked towards it, his heart pounding, feeling like a condemned man walking to the gallows. The dining room was a scene from a life he used to have, candles flickering, a roast beef glistening on a platter, a bottle of red wine breathing on the sideboard, but the atmosphere was funeral. Sarah sat at one end, her eyes red-rimmed, staring at her plate. Leo sat at the head of the table, Arthur's old spot in a metaphorical sense, carving the meat with precise, steady strokes. Two teenage boys, maybe 15 and 17, sat opposite Sarah, looking at Arthur with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, clearly having been briefed in hushed tones while he was in the bathroom. "Sit," Leo said, gesturing to the empty chair at the far end of the table, the spot furthest from the family. Arthur sat, the chair feeling too soft, the tablecloth too white. Leo placed a plate in front of him, a generous slab of beef, roasted potatoes, glazed carrots, and the smell hit Arthur's empty stomach with such force that he actually whimpered, a pathetic animal sound that made Sarah flinch. He picked up his fork, his hand trembling so hard the metal clicked against the china, and he shoveled the food into his mouth, chewing without tasting, swallowing huge boluses of meat, desperate to fill the void inside before they changed their mind and threw him out. He ate with his head down, protecting his plate with his arm, a habit learned in the shelters, and for 5 minutes the only sound in the room was his ragged breathing and the scraping of cutlery.
When he finally slowed, wiping gravy from his beard with the back of his hand before remembering the napkin, he looked up to find the entire family watching him. The boys looked terrified. Sarah looked devastated. But Leo, he just looked disappointed. "The wine is in 1998, Leo said quietly, pouring a glass and sliding it down the table. "You used to say anything younger than 10 years wasn't fit for vinegar, remember?" The reference to the past was a razor blade. Arthur stared at the wine, the ruby liquid shimmering in the candlelight. "I remember," he whispered. "I remember everything." The alcohol, when he took a sip, burned his throat, a familiar fire he hadn't tasted since he drank his last bottle of cheap vodka in the parking lot where he lost the car. "How did this happen, Arthur?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We saw the news about the company in 2008. We knew you lost the buildings. But this?" She gestured to his emaciated frame. Arthur